Final Fantasy XVI has sold over 3 million copies in its first week. Fans are already craving for DLC, and Square Enix has come out saying that they would be exploring the possibility of including DLC for the game that was initially designed not to include any of that. The internet has been debating about whether or not Final Fantasy XVI has been a success since its launch last month as a PS5 exclusive title. Having sold over 3 million units in the first few days, Square Enix has officially broken the ice, reporting to IGN that they deem their sales of this latest Final Fantasy to be a success. This is what Square Enix had to say in a statement from Square Enix to IGN, in, quote, "Square Enix considers the initial sales results of Final Fantasy XVI to be extremely strong, and we will continue to carry out a wide range of initiatives to encourage even more people to play the game," end quote. This is certainly a nice thing to hear, since Square Enix infamously has come public about their disappointment in certain games they've published in the past, most notably the high-grossing Tomb Raider games that failed to meet the company's sales goals. With Final Fantasy XVI releasing solely on the PS5 for the considerable future until an eventual PC release at an undisclosed date, Square Enix argues that, according to the number of PS5 systems sold, the attach rate for Final Fantasy XVI has performed remarkably well. Quote, "Taking into consideration the sales figures of the acclaimed Final Fantasy VII Remake and the difference in size of the install base of the PS4 at the time of this title's release, we can see that the attach rate of Final Fantasy XVI is considerably high given the PS5 install base," end quote. Considering Final Fantasy VII Remake sold 3.5 million units in its first 3 days on the PS4, with an install base that was approaching 100 million consoles sold at the time, the attach rate for Final Fantasy XVI is certainly more impressive, and this news is reassuring to not just Square Enix, but to us fans of the game who are interested in seeing more investment in Final Fantasy XVI going forward. In my most recent video surrounding Final Fantasy XVI, linked in the description and here in this card, we discussed how Final Fantasy XVI producer Yoshi P expressed interest in making potential DLC for the game due to the success of the title, and due to players expressing interest in exploring other aspects that could be further fleshed out in DLC. This news is particularly exciting, and by the time the game eventually launches on the PC next year, that will only further increase the total sales of the game. Yoshi P has alluded to his interest in making DLC content for certain characters, like Cid in particular, where his DLC would focus more intimately on his story and how he came to be the popular character he is in Final Fantasy XVI. To learn more about a potential Cid DLC, go watch this video in the card on your screen. While we do not know the extent of how well the game is selling nearly a month after its release, we do know that, especially in Japan, the sales of the game started exceptionally high for a PS5 release, but then ultimately dropped significantly after the first week on the market. Having sold 336,000 physical copies in its first week in Japan, this was especially surprising to see, seeing as Elden Ring held the second best launch week in Japan on the PS5, with 90,000 units sold, and Resident Evil 4 Remake having sold 89,000 copies in its first week. While this is all great news, the game managed to sell just north of 30,000 units in its second week in Japan, slipping substantially. While Japan is indeed an important country for PlayStation and the Final Fantasy brand, the game has done exceptionally well elsewhere around the world, sitting close to or at the #1 slot for game releases during its launch week and performing incredibly well in the month of June. Whether this is enough for Square Enix to decide to put more resources into the game for a potential DLC or in making a sequel to Final Fantasy XVI, I'm sure talks are being made. With Square Enix, quote, "carrying out a wide range of initiatives to encourage even more people to play the game," could this mean that they are hinting at more content or expansion to the game and its universe in the future? With so many avenues still able to explore, like the Leviathan icon and its dominant DLC episodes similar to the Final Fantasy XV character episodes focusing on specific characters in Final Fantasy XVI, added dungeons and boss encounters, there are a lot of ways to continue investment in Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI is a great game as it stands, but many of you from the previous video I made are itching for even more Final Fantasy XVI content. So here's hoping we get more out of Valisthea and the excellent cast in future content to Final Fantasy XVI. Regardless, we have a lot more Final Fantasy coming our way, with the second chapter in the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy coming early next year in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, so stay tuned for more information surrounding that game. Make sure to watch this video here for the incredible story of Cid and how Yoshi P would like to make DLC about this iconic character. Thank you all for the awesome support, and I'll see you real soon in the next one.